The front door slammed behind me, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the wealthy, manicured neighborhood. And in that chilling silence, I realized my own flesh and blood had just been stolen from me. I am Arthur. I am 68 years old, and for the last decade, ever since my beloved wife passed away, I have lived a life entirely by my own careful design. I reside in a modest, cedar-shingled cottage on the quiet edge of town. I drive a trusty 20-year-old pickup truck that boasts rusted wheel wells, but a beautifully maintained engine that has never once failed me. My days are incredibly quiet. I spend my early mornings outside, meticulously tending to my outdoor hydroponic phalaenopsis orchids. Growing them outside in this fluctuating climate without a speck of soil is a delicate, often unforgiving process. It requires precisely balancing water flow, ambient light, and liquid nutrients. It demands the kind of quiet, steady patience and observation that most modern, fast-paced men completely lack. It is a simple life, a peaceful life, and exactly the life I wanted the entire world to see. Of course, a simple, unassuming life is often just a carefully constructed curtain, hiding a foundation far more powerful and complex than anyone in my immediate family could possibly comprehend. My entire world revolves around three very specific people. My daughter, Sarah, is the absolute light of my life. She has a gentle, empathetic soul, perhaps entirely too gentle for the harsh, transactional realities of the modern world. And then there are my two beautiful grandchildren. Leo is 8 years old, a bright, inquisitive boy with a deep fascination for how things are built and engineered. Maya is 6, a whirlwind of sweet giggles, boundless imagination, and scraped knees. They are my heartbeat. Whenever I pull my old, rattling truck into their sprawling, paved driveway, their faces light up. They come running out the front door, and for a few hours, the world feels perfectly aligned. But then, inevitably, there is Richard. Richard is my son-in-law, though uttering the title feels like swallowing a spoonful of bitter ash. He is a mid-level executive at one of the largest, most aggressive commercial real estate firms in the state. Richard is a man defined entirely by luxury logos, exorbitant price tags, and the desperate, gnawing need to be perceived as the most important person in any room he walks into. He drives a leased German sports car that he complains about constantly because the ride is too stiff. Yet he refuses to trade it in because of the status the hood ornament provides. He wears tailored suits that cost more than the first mortgage I ever took out. To Richard, a human being's worth is measured strictly and mercilessly by the digits in their bank account, the prestige of their job title, and the exclusivity of their zip code. Consequently, he looks at me not as a father-in-law, not as a family member, but as a muddy stain on his perfectly curated, high-income aesthetic. He has always assumed my worn flannel shirts, my calloused hands, and my small cottage were the undeniable marks of a lifetime of financial failure. He had absolutely no idea who he was actually dealing with, a fatal, arrogant miscalculation I was not quite ready to correct. The absolute breaking point arrived on a crisp, deeply uncomfortable Sunday evening. I had been formally invited to their massive, sterile suburban fortress for a family dinner. It was Leo's birthday weekend, and I would not have missed it for the world. I arrived in my old truck, parking it carefully on the far edge of the driveway, well away from Richard's gleaming monstrosity of a vehicle. I walked into the house carrying a surprisingly heavy cardboard box. Inside were 2 hand-carved wooden toys I had spent the better part of the last month making in my backyard shed. For Leo, I had constructed a complex, mechanical wooden puzzle box out of polished mahogany and oak, featuring interlocking gears and hidden, sliding compartments. For Maya, I had carved a beautiful, fully articulated wooden horse, sanded perfectly smooth to the touch and painted with safe, natural oils. The atmosphere inside the house was stifling. We sat around their massive, cold marble dining table. Richard spent the first 45 minutes of the meal loudly complaining about his supposedly incompetent colleagues. He then transitioned seamlessly into boasting about a massive retail development project he was spearheading. He spoke endlessly of an impending corporate promotion that would elevate him to senior vice president, waving his crystal wine glass around like a monarch addressing his loyal, yet perpetually disappointing, subjects. Sarah sat quietly beside him, her eyes cast downward, mechanically cutting her food into tiny, even pieces. The vibrant, fiercely independent artist I had raised had been slowly, methodically ground down into a silent, accommodating accessory for Richard's fragile ego. After the agonizing dinner finally concluded, we moved to the living room, and I gave the children their gifts. Leo's eyes went wide with genuine wonder as he turned the intricate, smooth gears of the puzzle box, listening to the satisfying wooden clicks. Maya immediately gasped, throwing her arms around the wooden horse and hugging it tightly to her chest. They were thrilled. It was a moment of true, pure, unplugged childhood joy. Richard, however, sneered from across the room. He dramatically sighed, set down his drink, and walked over to a high-end designer shopping bag resting on the immaculate sofa. He reached inside and pulled out two pristine, outrageously expensive tablet computers. Still wrapped in tight plastic, he tossed them onto the glass coffee table with a loud, dismissive clatter. "Here you go, kids," he announced loudly, making sure his voice carried over their happy chatter. "Something actually useful. Not some dusty, splintered junk from a local flea market." I felt a sudden, tight knot of white-hot anger form deep in my chest. I took a slow breath, forcing my heart rate down. "I made those for them, Richard," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. "They took weeks of careful, intentional work." Richard laughed, a harsh, grating, deeply condescending sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Exactly my point. Arthur, you have weeks of free time because you have absolutely nothing going on in your pathetic life. No ambition, no assets, no future. You think carving little scraps of dead wood makes up for the fact that you can barely afford the gasoline to drive your piece of garbage truck over here?" "Richard, please," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, her shoulders shrinking inward. "Do not do this today. It is Leo's birthday." He ignored his wife completely, stepping closer to me, aggressively invading my personal space. He glared down at me, his face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. "I am profoundly sick of you bringing this disgusting poverty mindset into my beautiful house. Look at you. Just look at yourself. You are a 68-year-old man driving a rusted piece of garbage, living in a glorified shack. I am building an empire. I am shaping the commercial skyline of this entire city. You are a loser. Arthur, a complete, unmitigated loser. And I will not have my children infected by your pathetic, embarrassing lack of success for one more minute." I stood up slowly from the armchair. I did not raise my voice. I did not clench my fists. But the sheer, unadulterated disrespect radiating from this arrogant boy was suffocating. "You measure a man entirely by his wallet. Richard," I said softly, looking him dead in the eye. "That is a very fragile, very dangerous way to live your life." His face flushed a deep, furious crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. "Get out!" he hissed, his arm shooting out, pointing a rigid finger toward the heavy mahogany front door. "Get out of my house right now!" And I mean it this time. "Old man, you are banned. Arthur, you do not come back here. You do not call my wife. You do not come within 100 yards of my children ever again. If you so much as set foot on my sidewalk, I will have the police arrest you for trespassing. I am cutting your toxic, broke influence out of their lives permanently." I shifted my gaze to Sarah. She was crying silently, her hands gripping the edge of the sofa so hard her knuckles were completely white. She was terrified of him. The emotional battering she had endured behind closed doors for a decade had completely paralyzed her. She could not speak up to defend me, nor could she summon the strength to defend her children's fundamental right to see their own grandfather. She just stood there and wept, Leo and Maya were frozen in place, tightly clutching the wooden toys I had made them, their small faces pale with deep confusion and sudden fear. I knew in my bones that if I fought back right then, in his house, under his rules, the police would undoubtedly be called, and it would only traumatize my grandchildren further. Richard thrived on chaotic, loud, dominant confrontations where he held the territorial advantage. I needed to de-escalate. I needed to leave. "I love you, Leo." "I love you, Maya," I said softly, looking only at their frightened faces, projecting all the warmth I could muster. "I will see you very soon. I promise you that." I turned my back on Richard and walked out the door. The heavy, solid wood slammed shut behind me, the deadbolt clicking into place with a definitive, hollow thud that seemed to vibrate through the soles of my shoes. I walked slowly down the long, sweeping paved driveway toward my old truck. I climbed into the worn, familiar driver's seat, inserted the key into the ignition, and listened to the engine rumble to life. I did not feel defeated. I did not feel broken. As I put the truck into gear and drove away from the sprawling, soulless estate, a profound, icy calm washed over every inch of my body. Richard truly believed he had just won a permanent, flawless victory against a helpless, impoverished old man. He honestly thought he had severed my ties to my family with a single, arrogant command. He had absolutely no idea he had just awakened a sleeping giant, and he was completely, blissfully blind to the absolute, meticulous destruction that was about to rain down upon his fragile, pathetic kingdom. The drive back to my quiet, dark house felt like a slow march toward an inevitable war, the kind of battle where the enemy has absolutely no idea they have already lost. I had played the harmless, invisible old man for far too long, and tonight, that gentle facade was going to die. The tires of my old truck crunched softly against the gravel driveway of my cottage. The night air was biting, but I barely felt the cold. My chest was tight with a potent mixture of deep heartbreak and an icy, terrifying clarity. I walked through the front door, turning on a single lamp in the living room. The silence of the house, usually a comforting blanket, now felt oppressive and heavy. I thought of Sarah's terrified, tear-stained face. I thought of Leo and Maya, clutching the wooden toys I had made for them, their large eyes completely devoid of the joy they had shown just moments before. Richard had crossed an unforgivable line. He had not just insulted me, he had imprisoned my daughter and stolen my grandchildren. I walked past the modest kitchen and stepped into my small, wood-paneled study. I sat down in my worn leather armchair and let the reality of the situation settle over me. Richard honestly believed I was a pathetic, penniless failure. He looked at my simple life and saw nothing but defeat. He did not know that this life was a conscious, deliberate choice. 10 years ago, my beautiful wife, Eleanor, passed away after a long, exhausting illness. In the aftermath of that devastating loss, the boardrooms, the endless aggressive negotiations, and the relentless pursuit of capital completely lost their meaning. I realized I had spent decades building an empire while sacrificing the simple, quiet moments with the woman I loved. When she was gone, I wanted nothing more to do with that cutthroat world. So, I walked away. I stepped down from the daily operations, bought this quiet little cottage, and faded completely into obscurity. I traded tailored wool suits for soft flannel and board meetings for morning coffee on a quiet porch. But I did not sell my life's work. I retained 60% of the voting shares of Vanguard Commercial Holdings, the exact same massive, aggressive real estate firm where Richard currently spent every waking hour desperately trying to climb the middle management ladder. I was not just a retired businessman. I was the silent, absolute king of the very castle Richard worshipped. He bowed to executives who ultimately answered to a board that served strictly at my personal pleasure. I stood up and walked over to the heavy oak bookshelf resting against the far wall of the study. I reached behind a row of thick, leather-bound encyclopedias and pressed a small, hidden latch. The bookshelf clicked softly and swung open. revealing a massive, solid steel wall safe that had not been opened in nearly 5 years. I turned the heavy metal dial, listening to the solid, satisfying mechanical clunks. Left to 34, right to 82, left to 12. The heavy locking bolts retracted with a deep, echoing thud. I pulled the heavy door open. Inside rested the dormant artifacts of my former life. Stacked neatly were thick files of legal documents, private equity portfolios, and heavily guarded corporate contacts. I bypassed the stacks of bearer bonds and property deeds, reaching straight for a small, black, encrypted mobile phone resting on the middle shelf. I plugged it into a charger on my desk. While I waited for the battery to find life, I pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger containing unlisted direct numbers to the most powerful financial and legal minds in the entire state. The phone screen flickered on, glowing with a harsh, cold light in the dim study. I dialed a highly secure number I knew by heart. It was nearing midnight, a time when most reasonable men were fast asleep, but I knew Marcus would be awake. Marcus was my oldest friend, my former ruthless protege, and the current public chief executive officer of Vanguard Commercial Holdings. The line rang twice before a sharp, awake voice answered. "This is Marcus." "Marcus," I said, my voice steady and low. "It is Arthur." There was a stunned, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was thick with genuine shock. "Arthur, good heavens, it has been years. I almost did not recognize the number. Is everything all right? Is it Sarah?" "Sarah is physically fine, Marcus, but she is trapped," I replied, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the heavy oak desk. "And I need your help to tear down the walls around her. I am calling about one of your employees, a mid-level director in the Downtown Development Division, Richard Sterling." I heard the faint clicking of a computer keyboard in the background. Marcus was already working. "Sterling." "Yes, I know the name. Flashy, arrogant, closes a decent number of mid-sized deals, but he is desperately hungry for the senior vice president slot opening up next quarter. He is your son-in-law, Arthur. We discussed this briefly when they got married, though you asked me to never intervene. I am officially changing that directive," I stated coldly. "Tonight, Richard kicked me out of his home. He permanently banned me from seeing my grandchildren, and he has spent the last decade emotionally crushing my daughter into total submission. He did this because he believes I am a worthless, penniless old man. He is drunk on the minor amount of power your company has given him, and he is using it to destroy my family. Tell me exactly what you want done, Arthur," Marcus said, his tone shifting instantly from surprised friend to a ruthless corporate general ready for a massive offensive. "I can have his desk cleared out and his keycard deactivated before the sun comes up. I can fire him with a single phone call." "No," I said firmly. "Firing him right now is entirely too easy. If you just fire him, he will spin the narrative. He will play the victim to Sarah. He will blame office politics, and he will use the crisis to tighten his grip on my daughter even further. A simple termination will not break his ego. We need to dismantle his entire sense of reality. We need to build him up to the absolute highest peak of his arrogance, and then we need to rip the entire foundation out from under him, completely and legally." I also knew that men like Richard, men completely obsessed with the appearance of wealth, almost always leave a trail of reckless, desperate financial decisions in their wake. A hidden vulnerability I fully intended to expose and exploit to its absolute limits. I outlined the preliminary stages of my strategy to Marcus. I needed Richard completely isolated in his professional arrogance. I needed him to believe he was an untouchable titan of industry, moving so fast he would never bother to look down at the trap closing around his ankles. "I want you to assign him a massive, impossible target, Marcus," I instructed. "I am going to set up a blind corporate entity, an international investment fund. I will funnel $200 million into it. You are going to tell Richard that securing this fund is his ultimate test. If he lands the account, he gets the senior vice president title, the corner office, and the 7-figure bonus. We are going to feed his narcissism until he is completely blinded by his own greed." "He will take the bait without hesitation," Marcus agreed, a hint of dark amusement in his voice. "He is exactly the kind of arrogant fool who thinks he can charm his way into managing 9-figure accounts. But Arthur, you understand that setting up an elaborate corporate snare like this requires absolute precision. If he senses a trap, he will panic." "He will not sense a thing," I promised, looking at the glowing red light of the encrypted phone. "Because Richard is fighting a ghost. He is fighting an impoverished old man in a rusted truck, completely unaware of the devastating corporate leviathan silently moving through the deep water right beneath his feet." We spent the next 2 hours meticulously planning the logistical framework. Marcus would have his most trusted corporate attorneys begin fast-tracking the creation of the dummy corporation by sunrise. I would handle the private investigation into Richard's personal finances, bringing in professionals who specialized in finding the dirty money vain men try so desperately to hide. By the time I finally ended the call at 2 o'clock in the morning, the heavy, suffocating feeling of helplessness had completely vanished from my chest. I closed the heavy steel door of the safe, spinning the dial to lock away my old life once again, keeping only the encrypted phone and the ledger on my desk. I walked over to the window, looking out into the pitch-black night toward the city skyline, where the towering glass headquarters of Vanguard Commercial Holdings pierced the darkness. Richard wanted to play a game of power and wealth. He wanted to use his status as a weapon to sever my family, believing he held all the high cards. I was going to teach him a brutal, unforgettable lesson about what true power actually looked like. He had banned a poor grandfather from his driveway, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just invited a billionaire shark into his living room. The clock was officially ticking, and Richard's arrogant, manufactured empire was already burning. He just could not smell the smoke yet. A man drowning in his own arrogance rarely notices the water rising around his throat until it is far too late to swim. While Richard was busy toasting to his untouchable brilliance in a high-end downtown steakhouse, I was quietly purchasing the very ocean he was about to sink in. By Tuesday morning, Marcus had executed the first phase of our strategy flawlessly. He called Richard into the top-floor executive suite, an incredibly rare occurrence for a mid-level director. Marcus played the part of the demanding, high-stakes CEO with absolute perfection. He sat across from Richard and explained that a massive, aggressively expanding international investment fund was looking for a domestic partner to handle a $200 million commercial development portfolio. Marcus looked Richard dead in the eye and told him that if he could land this single, monumental whale of an account, the senior vice president title, the coveted corner office, and a guaranteed 7-figure performance bonus were entirely his. Richard took the bait so hard he nearly choked on it. Through the quiet network of trusted informants, Marcus kept within the office. I learned that Richard spent the rest of that afternoon strutting through the corporate bullpens like a newly crowned emperor. He berated his hard-working assistants, dismissively waved off his colleagues, and immediately spent 2 hours on company time shopping online for an even more expensive, custom-ordered luxury vehicle. He honestly believed his sheer, undeniable charisma had magically manifested this golden opportunity. He had absolutely no idea the massive investment fund was nothing more than a freshly inked legal fiction resting in a secure filing cabinet, funded entirely by the very same grandfather he had banished from his driveway just 48 hours prior. But while Richard was busy mentally measuring the custom drapes for his new executive suite, I was methodically tearing through his carefully constructed reality. I reached out to Elias, an old, highly discreet associate from my active corporate days. Elias was not a traditional private investigator who peeked through windows with a camera. He was a master forensic accountant, a man who could track a single hidden dollar through a labyrinth of international shell companies while blindfolded. I gave Elias a simple, heavily funded directive: tear Richard Sterling's personal and financial life apart, down to the last heavily mortgaged penny. I suspected Richard was living well beyond his means to maintain his flashy, aggressive facade. Men who obsess over the size of the logo on their watch usually have terrifyingly small bank accounts. The truth, however, was so much darker and more pathetic than I could have ever anticipated. 2 days later, Elias sat across from me in my small, wood-paneled study. He did not say a single word of greeting. He simply slid a thick, heavy manila folder across my oak desk. I opened it, and the cold, hard numbers painted a picture of absolute, desperate ruin. Richard was not just keeping up appearances. He was completely, catastrophically broke. His leased German sports car, his closets full of bespoke suits, his highly exclusive country club memberships, they were all being desperately held together by a terrifying mountain of high-interest, unsecured debt. He had taken out a massive, secret second mortgage on the sprawling suburban house, a house that Sarah believed was completely paid off. If he missed even 2 months of payments on his sprawling web of credit, the bank would foreclose immediately and throw my daughter and my grandchildren out onto the street without a moment of hesitation. But that was not the piece of paper that made my blood run completely cold. Buried near the back of the dossier, tagged with a red sticky note by Elias, were the banking records for Leo and Maya. When they were born, I had secretly established modest but sturdy college savings accounts in their names, depositing steady amounts over the years and trusting Sarah and Richard to manage them until the kids came of age. The bank statements in the folder showed a current balance of absolutely zero. Over the last 3 years, Richard had systematically and completely liquidated both accounts. He had stolen his own children's future, their education, and their security, and he did not do it to pay for emergency medical bills or to keep a roof over their heads. Elias tracked the withdrawn funds directly to a string of disastrous private poker debts and the exorbitant, non-refundable initiation fee at a golf club he visited perhaps twice a year. I sat in my quiet study, staring at the bank statements bearing my young grandchildren's names, feeling a deep, quiet fury settle permanently into my bones. Richard was not just an arrogant, classless fool. He was a parasite. He was actively destroying my family from the inside out to feed his own insatiable, pathetic vanity. I carefully placed the documents back into the folder, smoothing out the edges. The time for simply teaching him a lesson in humility was over. I was going to surgically remove him from our lives, leaving absolutely nothing behind but the ashes of his ego. I picked up my encrypted phone and finalized the creation of the dummy corporation with my legal team. We named it Apex Global Holdings, to ensure it passed any internal corporate audit Marcus might be forced to run. My private financial managers wired $200 million of my own personal wealth into the corporate escrow account, making it entirely legitimate, heavily funded, and terrifyingly real on paper. It was a staggering amount of money, an undeniable force of corporate gravity that Richard would never be able to resist. I instructed my team to reach out to Richard directly, strictly bypassing all other executives at Vanguard Commercial Holdings. We demanded that Richard personally handle all communications, all preliminary presentations, and all strategic pitches. We made him feel absolutely indispensable. We made him feel like a god among mere middle managers. The trap was completely set, the steel jaws wide open, waiting patiently for Richard to take that final, fatal step into the dark. Yet, before the metal teeth could snap shut and destroy him, I had a far more delicate and deeply painful task ahead of me. I had to find a way to circumvent Richard's ban, get Sarah completely alone, and show her the undeniable, horrifying proof of who the man sleeping next to her truly was, knowing full well that handing her that manila folder would shatter her entire world into 1,000 jagged pieces. A man who believes he is untouchable will always reveal his true cruelty, stripping away any lingering disguise. As Richard prepared to swallow the poisoned bait I had meticulously set for him, he unleashed a new level of terror upon the only people I loved. My internal sources at Vanguard Commercial Holdings kept me updated by the hour. Richard had taken complete control of the Apex Global Holdings account, acting as the sole liaison for the $200 million portfolio. Marcus, playing his role perfectly, gave Richard total autonomy, feeding him enough rope to hang himself twice over. Richard began treating the office staff like indentured servants. He demanded his coffee be brewed at exact temperatures, and he aggressively berated junior analysts for minor formatting errors in his massive, glossy pitch decks. He was a petty tyrant handed a temporary crown, and his ego expanded to fill every room he entered. Unfortunately, the nightmare he created at the office was nothing compared to the suffocating atmosphere he brought home to my daughter and grandchildren. Feeling invincible, Richard no longer bothered to hide his contempt for Sarah. A neighbor who occasionally checked on my orchids told me she heard him shouting from the driveway, furious that his dinner was 5 minutes late while he was, in his own words, busy building an empire. He banished Leo and Maya to their rooms the moment he stepped through the door, claiming their childish noise was interfering with his elite cognitive process. He was systematically isolating Sarah, tearing down her self-worth so she would never have the strength to question his authority or his sudden influx of supposed wealth. Richard's foolish arrogance would soon become the exact weapon I used to trap him in a courtroom of my own making. That trap took its first definitive shape on a quiet Thursday morning when a delivery driver knocked on my cottage door. He handed me a thick, stiff envelope sent via certified mail. I signed for it, walked into my kitchen, and sliced it open. Inside was a formal cease and desist letter, drafted on expensive, heavy stock paper from a mid-tier local law firm. The language was aggressively cruel and legally laughable. It officially accused me of emotional harassment and explicitly threatened to have me arrested by local law enforcement if I drove my truck within 5 miles of their suburban subdivision. It stated that my poverty and my lack of social standing were a detriment to his family's reputation. He actually paid a lawyer hundreds of dollars to type out his narcissistic delusions and mail them to me. A younger, more volatile man might have driven straight to Richard's office and physically dragged him across his pristine glass desk. But I am not a volatile man. I am a man who spent 40 years destroying arrogant adversaries through flawless, patient strategy. I did not crumple the letter. I did not raise my voice. I placed the document carefully on my kitchen counter, poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee, and picked up my encrypted phone. If Richard wanted to introduce lawyers into this family dispute, I was more than happy to oblige him. But I do not play in the minor leagues. I placed a call to Evelyn Thorne. In the high-stakes world of family law, Evelyn is not just an attorney. She is an apex predator. She handles the divorces of billionaires, politicians, and industry titans. She is notorious for leaving opposing counsel completely bankrupt and emotionally devastated. I had retained her services a decade ago for a complex corporate merger, and she answered my call on the first ring. I drove to her immaculate, high-security office downtown later that afternoon. I did not wear my flannel shirt. I wore a bespoke charcoal wool suit that I had not taken out of its garment bag in 5 years. The receptionist offered me sparkling water, but Evelyn bypassed the pleasantries, ushering me directly into her private conference room. I laid everything out on the long mahogany table. I gave her the cease and desist letter, which she read and immediately dismissed with a cold, sharp laugh. Then, I slid the explosive forensic accounting folder across the table. I watched her sharp eyes scan the documents detailing Richard's crushing, hidden debt, the secret second mortgage, and, most importantly, the systematic theft of my grandchildren's college funds. "Arthur," Evelyn said, her voice a razor blade wrapped in velvet. "This man is not just a narcissist. He is a financial criminal. This is clear-cut embezzlement of familial assets. He has forged signatures to drain these trust accounts. When I am finished with him, he will be lucky if he only loses his house. I can easily refer this to the district attorney for criminal fraud charges. Hold the criminal charges for now," I instructed, tapping the table. "I want a complete, ironclad divorce decree ready to file the absolute second I give the signal. I want full, undisputed custody of the children awarded to Sarah. I want an immediate freezing of all marital assets, preventing him from hiding whatever pennies he has left. I want an emergency order of protection forcing him out of the house. We need to build a legal fortress around Sarah so tightly that Richard cannot even breathe in her direction without violating a court order. Evelyn smiled, a terrifying expression that meant she was ready to go to war. She promised the preliminary filings would be drafted and ready for Sarah's signature within 48 hours. Now, the most delicate and dangerous phase of the plan had arrived. I needed to show Sarah the truth, but Richard had heavily monitored her phone and restricted her movements. I needed him entirely out of the picture for at least an entire day. I called Marcus on the encrypted line. "Send him away," I ordered. "Create a mandatory, high-level site inspection. Tell him the owners of Apex Global Holdings require him to personally tour a potential commercial property in another state. Make it sound urgent, lavish, and absolutely critical to his promotion. Put him on a first-class flight and book him into a 5-star hotel." Marcus chuckled warmly. "I will have him on a plane to Chicago by tomorrow morning. The company will cover every exorbitant expense. Naturally, he will be gone for exactly 36 hours. Arthur, that is your window." The following morning, I watched from a safe distance as a sleek, black, luxury town car pulled into Richard's driveway. Richard emerged from the house wearing a perfectly tailored suit, carrying a designer leather overnight bag. He did not look back to wave at his wife or his children. He simply slid into the back seat of the vehicle, utterly absorbed in his own inflated sense of importance. The car pulled away, heading toward the airport. As soon as the street was clear, I drove my old truck to a quiet, unassuming coffee shop located 2 towns over, well outside Richard's normal sphere of influence. I parked in the back alley and walked inside, taking a booth in the far, dimly lit corner. I pulled out a prepaid, untraceable burner phone I had purchased strictly for this moment. I dialed the landline number to Sarah's house, knowing Richard could not intercept a direct call to the wall phone while he was at 30,000 feet. Sarah answered on the 4th ring, her voice small and hesitant. "Hello? Sarah, it is Dad," I said quickly, keeping my voice gentle but urgent. "Do not hang up. Richard is on a flight to Chicago. He cannot hear you. He cannot track you. You are completely safe right now." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Dad, you cannot call here. If he finds out, he will go crazy. He banned you." "He said he would call the police. He is not calling anyone." "Sweetheart," I reassured her, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I need to see you, just you. Leave the kids with Mrs. Higgins next door. I know she is always happy to watch them. I need you to drive to the Elm Street Diner in Westbridge. Park in the back. Come in through the kitchen entrance. The owner is an old friend of mine. We need to talk about your future, and we need to talk about Richard." She hesitated for a long, agonizing moment. The fear he had instilled in her was a heavy, suffocating blanket. "Please, Sarah," I pleaded softly. "I promise you, I will never let him hurt you again. Just trust me this one time. Okay?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "I will be there in an hour." Sarah agreed to meet me, completely unaware that the heavy manila folder resting inside my leather briefcase was about to permanently rewrite the history of her entire marriage. The illusion Richard had built to trap her was about to shatter, and I was going to be the one swinging the hammer. Watching my only daughter walk through the rusted back metal door of a diner kitchen, looking over her shoulder like a hunted, terrified animal, was the exact moment my quiet patience completely transformed into absolute, unforgiving resolve. The man who did this to her was going to lose everything he valued, and I was going to ensure the destruction was permanent. The Elm Street Diner was practically empty at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The air smelled of old coffee and frying oil, a sharp contrast to the sterile, heavily perfumed air of Richard's sprawling suburban fortress. I sat in a faded red vinyl booth in the darkest corner of the room, a heavy leather briefcase resting on the table in front of me, when Sarah finally slid into the seat across from me. My heart broke. She looked utterly exhausted. Her eyes were rimmed with dark circles, and she was wearing a faded, oversized sweater, nervously picking at a loose thread on the sleeve. Her husband wore tailored, three-piece wool suits that cost thousands of dollars. Yet he made his wife feel like she was entirely unworthy of basic comfort. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling as she glanced nervously toward the front windows. "I cannot stay long. If his flight lands early, if he tries to call the house and I'm not there to answer, he will know." He checks the security cameras on the driveway. "The cameras have been remotely disabled since noon," I said calmly, sliding a warm mug of tea across the table toward her. I had a very discreet associate take care of the network. Richard is currently sitting in a luxury hotel suite in Chicago, completely obsessed with a massive corporate presentation. He is not looking at you, Sarah. For the first time in a decade, you are entirely invisible to him. Drink your tea. You are safe here. She took a shaky breath and wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic mug, but her eyes remained wide with deeply ingrained fear. "He banned you. Dad, he said you were a toxic influence. He said your poverty was going to ruin the kids. Why are you wearing a suit? What is going on? Richard has built your entire marriage on a foundation of aggressive, manipulative lies," I began, keeping my voice low and steady. "He convinced you that I am a failure so he could isolate you from the only person who would ever stand up to him. He needed you to believe he was the absolute sole provider, the king of your world, so you would never dare to question his authority." I unlatched the heavy brass locks of my leather briefcase. "It is time you knew exactly who your father is, Sarah, and more importantly, exactly who your husband is." I reached into the briefcase and pulled out a thick, legal portfolio bound in dark leather. I opened it and laid the first stack of documents on the table. They were official, watermarked corporate ownership records. I pointed to the heavily embossed seal at the top of the page. "Read the name of the holding company. Sweetheart," I instructed gently. Sarah leaned forward, squinting in the dim light. "Vanguard Commercial Holdings. Dad, that is Richard's company. That is where he works." "Why do you have these?" "I do not just have them, Sarah," I replied, watching the confusion wash over her face. "I own them. When your mother passed away 10 years ago, I was lost. I had spent my entire adult life building a massive commercial real estate empire, and suddenly, the wealth meant absolutely nothing without her. So, I stepped away from the public eye. I bought the quiet cottage. I started growing orchids. I chose a life of absolute peace, but I never sold my majority stake. I still hold 60% of the voting shares of Vanguard. Richard bows to executives who answer strictly to me. I am not a poor, helpless old man. I am a billionaire, and I have spent the last 4 days quietly mobilizing every single ounce of that power against the man who threw me out of your house." Sarah stared at me, her mouth slightly open, entirely unable to process the magnitude of what I was saying. She looked from my tailored suit to the documents, and then back to my face, the illusion of my poverty. An illusion I had maintained for a decade to protect my own peace was completely shattered in an instant. "But the money," she stammered, shaking her head. "Richard makes so much money. He just bought another luxury car. He says we are in the top 1%. If you are wealthy, why is he always complaining about how much my groceries cost? Why does he make me feel like I am a financial burden?" "Because, Sarah," I said, the cold anger rising in my chest as I reached back into the briefcase. "Richard is a complete, categorical fraud." I pulled out the thick manila folder my forensic accountant, Elias, had compiled. I opened it and spread the damning financial records across the diner table. I showed her the staggering, suffocating credit card debts. I showed her the secret, high-interest second mortgage he had quietly taken out on their suburban home, leveraging the roof over her children's heads to pay for his elite country club memberships and his extravagant business dinners. "He is drowning, Sarah," I explained, tapping the horrifying bottom line on the ledger. "He is entirely broke. He uses his aggression and his arrogance to hide the fact that he is a financial failure. He creates chaos in your home, so you are too terrified to ever look at the bank statements." Sarah's eyes scanned the numbers. the reality of her husband's absolute betrayal slowly sinking into her bone. But she had not seen the worst of it yet. I took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the blow that would finally shatter the trauma bond keeping her tethered to that monster. I slid 2 specific bank statements out from the bottom of the pile and placed them directly in front of her. They were the college trust accounts I had secretly established for Leo and Maya years ago. "Look at the balances, Sarah," I said softly. She looked down. The numbers were printed clearly in harsh black ink. $0, 0 cents. "I do not understand," she whispered, her voice cracking, a single tear spilling over her lower lash line. "Those were for their education. We were not supposed to touch those until they turned 18. Where did it go? Where did my baby's money go?" "He stole it," I stated plainly, refusing to soften the brutal truth. "He systematically forged the withdrawal documents over the last 3 years. He completely liquidated his own children's future to cover a string of disastrous private gambling debts and the non-refundable initiation fees for a luxury golf resort he wanted to show off to his colleagues. He robbed Leo and Maya to feed his pathetic ego. That was the breaking point. I watched my daughter's deep, paralyzing fear evaporate, instantly replaced by a blinding, fierce, maternal rage. She let out a choked, devastated sob, covering her mouth with both hands as the tears began to stream down her face. The man she had spent 10 years trying to please, the man she had tiptoed around to keep the peace, had stolen the very foundation of her children's future just to buy himself a few fleeting moments of hollow status. I let her cry. I let the 10 years of repressed pain, manipulation, and profound disrespect flood out of her system in the quiet corner of that diner. When her breathing finally began to slow, I reached across the table and took both of her trembling hands in mine. "He is never going to hurt you again," I promised, my voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "He is never going to scream at you. He is never going to make you feel small. But I need you to be incredibly brave today. I need you to take the first step." I reached into the briefcase one last time and pulled out a crisp, pristine stack of legal documents. It was the ironclad divorce petition and the emergency custody filings drafted by Evelyn Thorne, the most ruthless family law attorney in the state. "These are preliminary divorce papers," I explained, placing a heavy silver pen on top of the stack. "They include an immediate freezing of all remaining marital assets and an emergency order granting you sole physical custody of Leo and Maya. If you sign these right now, my legal team will file them under seal this afternoon." Sarah stared at the pen. 10 years of psychological conditioning told her to run, to hide, to apologize to Richard for even looking at such a document. But then she looked back at the bank statements bearing her children's names, the physical proof of their stolen future. She picked up the silver pen. Her hand was shaking violently, but she pressed the heavy ink to the signature line and signed her name with a sharp, decisive stroke. She flipped the page and signed the next one, and then the next, completely severing her legal ties to the man who had destroyed her spirit. "Okay," she breathed out, dropping the pen on the table, a sudden, powerful wave of relief washing over her pale face. "What do we do now? He comes back tomorrow night. If I am in that house when he finds out, he will kill me. Dad." "You are not going back to that house tonight," I told her, carefully gathering the signed documents and placing them securely back into my briefcase. "I have already rented a massive, climate-controlled storage unit under a completely anonymous shell corporation. While Richard is toasting his supposed success in Chicago, I have a team of highly discreet movers waiting 3 blocks away from your neighborhood. You are going to go home, pack every single piece of clothing, every toy, and every precious memory that belongs to you and the children. My team will load it into an unmarked truck and secure it in the storage facility. Richard will not be able to track a single box." "And where will we sleep?" she asked, the practical reality of her escape finally dawning on her. "You and the children are coming to live with me at the cottage." I smiled, a genuine, warm feeling spreading through my chest for the first time in weeks. It is quiet. It is safe. And Richard is legally barred from coming within 5 miles of my property, a restriction he happily put in place himself. He built his own cage. Sarah. "We are just locking the door," she nodded, wiping the remaining tears from her cheeks, a new, resilient fire burning in her eyes. The terrified woman who had walked into the diner was completely gone, replaced by a fiercely protective mother ready to reclaim her life. She stood up, pulling her sweater tightly around her shoulders, completely unaware of the devastating corporate trap I had waiting for her husband. By Friday afternoon, the name Richard Sterling would be entirely erased from the commercial real estate industry, and his fragile ego would be publicly and mercilessly crushed beneath the heel of the very man he had dismissed as a penniless loser. But Sarah did not need to know the vicious mechanics of my vengeance just yet. A predator believes they are at the top of the food chain right up until the exact moment the actual hunter steps out of the shadows. Today, Richard was going to put on the performance of his life, completely oblivious to the fact that his magnificent stage was nothing more than a carefully constructed guillotine. Friday morning arrived with a crisp, clear sky, a beautiful, peaceful contrast to the absolute storm I was about to unleash inside the towering glass walls of Vanguard Commercial Holdings. Richard had returned from his lavish, entirely pointless trip to Chicago late Thursday night. He returned to a strangely quiet, deeply empty house, but he was so consumed by his impending corporate coronation that he completely missed the signs. He likely assumed Sarah had simply taken the children to a late movie or a friend's house to stay out of his incredibly important way. He did not check the closets to see that her clothes were gone. He did not notice the missing photographs from the mantel. He did not check the children's rooms to see the empty toy chests. He simply unpacked his designer bag, drank a glass of expensive scotch, and went to sleep, completely blind to the fact that the family he thought he commanded had already vanished safely into a heavily secured, climate-controlled storage unit and my quiet cottage. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, Richard confidently walked into the secondary executive conference room on the 40th floor. Waiting for him at the long mahogany table were 2 impeccably dressed, deeply intimidating men named Harrison and Vance. Richard firmly believed they were the cutthroat senior directors of Apex Global Holdings, the absolute gatekeepers to a $200 million empire. In reality, they were my personal, highly paid wealth managers, men who had spent the last 20 years fiercely and discreetly protecting my family's massive assets from Wall Street predators. I had given them strict, highly specific instructions for this meeting. They were to let Richard talk. They were to let him inflate his chest, boast about his connections, and promise the absolute moon. Through the secure, encrypted audio feed I was quietly monitoring from Marcus's office 2 floors above, I listened to my son-in-law perform. The sheer arrogance radiating through the speaker was genuinely nauseating. Richard spoke for 45 uninterrupted minutes, aggressively throwing around empty corporate buzzwords and taking unearned credit for massive downtown developments he had barely even visited. He spoke about his unique vision, his unparalleled aggressive negotiation tactics, and his deep understanding of high-net-worth clientele. Harrison and Vance played their parts with absolute, Oscar-worthy precision. They nodded thoughtfully, rubbing their chins. They praised his aggressive vision. They told him that Vanguard Commercial Holdings was incredibly lucky to have a young visionary of his caliber, and that Apex Global Holdings would be absolutely thrilled to trust their massive portfolio to his steady, capable hands. As Richard wrapped up his glossy, hollow pitch, practically glowing with unearned pride, Harrison stood up and shook his hand firmly, confirming the monumental deal was functionally his, pending one final, absolute formality. What Richard did not know was that this specific formality would tear his entire existence down to the studs and leave him with absolutely nothing. High on the dangerous adrenaline of his supposed victory, Richard did exactly what a desperate, deeply hollow man always does when he feels a sudden surge of unearned power. He left the corporate building on his lunch hour and walked directly into the most exclusive, heavily guarded jeweler in the downtown district. Elias, my master forensic accountant, was actively monitoring Richard's financial movements in real time. Within 20 minutes, my encrypted phone buzzed in my pocket. Richard had just financed a $75,000 platinum watch on a brand new, terrifyingly high-interest line of credit. He strapped a massive, ticking anchor of debt to his wrist just to celebrate a promotion that did not exist and a bonus he would never receive. He strutted back into the gleaming marble lobby of Vanguard Commercial Holdings, shooting his starched cuffs perfectly so the platinum caught the overhead light. He smiled at the security guards who usually ignored him. He was entirely unaware that the heavy ticking against his own pulse was a literal countdown to his own professional execution. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the final phase began. Marcus picked up his heavy office phone and dialed Richard's extension. I sat quietly in the corner of Marcus's sprawling executive suite, hidden safely in the deep shadows of a leather wingback chair. Marcus kept his voice perfectly professional, tightly masking the fierce anticipation we both felt. He told Richard that the Apex Global representatives were absolutely ecstatic. He said the board of directors had reviewed his flawless performance, and his promotion to senior vice president was effectively approved and ready for signatures. "I need you up in the main executive boardroom immediately." "Richard," Marcus ordered, his tone commanding and crisp. "The principal owner of Apex Global Holdings has just flown in. He is a very private, very traditional man. He insists on meeting the executive handling his $200 million account face-to-face before we sign the final contracts and officially announce your new title to the entire firm." I could practically hear Richard's heart hammering through the receiver. He eagerly agreed, promising to be there in 2 minutes, and hung up the phone with a sharp, excited clatter. I stood up from the leather chair, slowly smoothing the lapels of my dark, bespoke suit. I adjusted my silk tie and checked my reflection in the massive glass window overlooking the sprawling city skyline. For 10 long years, I had been Arthur the quiet grandfather, the humble man in the rusted truck, the harmless, invisible old widower. But as I walked toward the heavy oak doors of the boardroom, that gentle man completely faded away, replaced by the ruthless founder who had built this very empire from the ground up. I stepped into the adjoining private hallway, waiting silently for my cue. Down the long, polished marble corridor, the elevator chimed with a soft, bright sound. Richard stepped out, confidently adjusting his tie, checking his reflection in the glass of a framed painting, and admiring his brand-new, unpaid watch. He walked toward the boardroom with the swagger of a victorious king marching toward his rightful throne. He pushed open the heavy double doors, stepping into the massive, echoing space, entirely ready to claim his new kingdom, completely and utterly blind to the billionaire executioner waiting quietly in the wings. A man's true character is never revealed in his moments of defeat, but in the blinding, arrogant seconds right before he believes he has conquered the world. Richard walked into the executive boardroom, completely intoxicated by his own manufactured greatness, unaware that every step on that thick carpet brought him closer to the absolute edge of a sheer cliff. I knew exactly how his face would contort when he saw me standing there, but the real, suffocating devastation would not hit him until he finally understood the true weight of the sealed legal folders resting silently inside Marcus's leather portfolio. He still honestly thought this entire meeting was just about a lucrative corporate promotion, entirely blind to the terrifying reality that his entire professional, financial, and personal existence was about to be permanently erased from the earth. The main executive boardroom on the 40th floor of Vanguard Commercial Holdings was designed specifically to intimidate. It was a cavernous, perfectly soundproofed space. One entire wall was made of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a dizzying, unobstructed view of the sprawling city below. In the center of the room sat a massive, 40-foot table carved from a single, continuous piece of dark, polished mahogany. Marcus sat calmly near the head of the table, his hands folded neatly over a stack of crisp, watermarked documents. The oversized, high-backed leather chair at the absolute head of the table, the seat reserved strictly for the chairman of the board, remained empty. I stood completely still in the adjoining private antechamber, hidden behind a set of heavy, solid oak double doors. I could hear everything through the subtle, high-end acoustics of the room. The outer doors opened with a soft hiss, and Richard confidently strode into the boardroom. He did not walk, he paraded. I could hear the sharp, arrogant click of his expensive leather shoes against the hardwood border of the room. "Marcus," Richard announced, his voice booming with forced, unearned familiarity. "I understand we have a final hurdle to clear. I hope the Apex Global representative is ready to sign. I have a dinner reservation at 8 o'clock at the Capitol Grill to celebrate, and they hold the table for absolutely no one." "Have a seat, Richard," Marcus replied, his tone perfectly neutral, an ocean of ice hiding beneath a thin layer of professional courtesy. I heard the squeak of leather as Richard sank into a chair near the center of the table. He immediately shot his left arm out, resting it heavily on the polished mahogany to ensure the massive, shiny $75,000 platinum watch he had just financed was prominently displayed under the recessed lighting. "The board has reviewed your pitch," Marcus continued, tapping the edge of the documents against the table. "They were deeply impressed by your aggressive timeline and your supposed mastery of the downtown commercial district. The senior vice president title, the corner office, and the 7-figure performance bonus are all formally approved." Richard let out a low, breathy chuckle of pure, unfiltered smugness. "I told you, Marcus, I told you I was the only man in this entire firm who could land a $200 million whale. I know exactly how these elite, high-net-worth individuals think. I speak their language." "Indeed you do," Marcus said, his voice dropping slightly. "However, as I mentioned on the phone, the principal owner of Apex Global Holdings has one final, non-negotiable condition. He is an incredibly private man. He does not trust numbers on a spreadsheet. He trusts the measure of a man. He insisted on looking you directly in the eye before he signs over a single penny of his $200 million empire. He is waiting in the private antechamber right now." "Bring him out," Richard commanded, waving his hand dismissively as if he were ordering a waiter to bring the dessert menu. "Let us get this over with. I am ready to close this deal and claim my office." That was my cue. I reached out and grasped the heavy brass handles of the oak double doors. I did not push them open frantically or aggressively. I opened them with the slow, deliberate, heavy grace of a man who owned the very air inside the building. I stepped out of the shadows and into the blinding natural light of the boardroom. I was not wearing my faded flannel shirt. I was not wearing my worn denim jeans or my scuffed work boots. I was wearing a charcoal gray, flawlessly tailored bespoke wool suit cut perfectly to my shoulders. My shoes were polished black Oxfords that shone like black glass. I walked with my spine perfectly straight, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying authority that I had kept dormant for an entire decade. Richard was lounging back in his chair, a smug, relaxed smile plastered across his face. He turned his head casually to greet the mysterious billionaire. When his eyes finally locked onto my face, the physical reaction was immediate and violently pathetic. His smug smile did not just fade, it shattered. His jaw dropped slightly, his eyes widening in a mixture of profound confusion and sudden, hot embarrassment. For 3 long seconds, the massive boardroom was completely, agonizingly silent. Then, the frantic wheels of his arrogant mind desperately tried to rationalize what he was seeing. His brain, deeply poisoned by 10 years of treating me like a peasant, simply could not process the image of me standing in a billionaire's suit in the most secure room of his corporate fortress. Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh, though it sounded incredibly strained and thin. He abruptly pushed his chair back and stood up, pointing a trembling finger at me. "What in the absolute hell is this?" Richard snapped, his voice echoing off the glass walls. He turned to Marcus, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Marcus, how did this man get past the lobby security? This is a highly secure floor. Did he sneak up the freight elevator?" Marcus did not move a single muscle. He simply sat in his chair, watching Richard with the cold, detached fascination of a scientist observing a rat in a maze. When Marcus did not answer, Richard turned his vitriol back to me. He stepped forward, his chest puffed out, attempting to reclaim his manufactured dominance. "I told you yesterday. Arthur, I sent you a formal, legally binding cease and desist letter. You are banned from my property, and now you have the absolute pathetic audacity to follow me to my place of work? Are you completely insane? Did you rent that cheap suit just to come up here and beg me for money in front of my CEO?" I did not say a word. I simply continued to walk toward the head of the long mahogany table, my eyes locked dead onto his. My silence completely infuriated him. "Security!" Richard suddenly yelled, reaching for the heavy silver telephone resting on the center of the table. "I am calling building security right now. You are going to be arrested for trespassing. Arthur, I am going to have you dragged out of this building in handcuffs, and then I am going to make sure the police throw you in a holding cell for stalking me. You just ruined the biggest day of my life, you pathetic old loser." Richard's hand hovered over the phone keypad, his fingers trembling with rage. "Richard," Marcus said. It was just one word, but the sheer, crushing weight and terrifying coldness in Marcus's voice froze Richard completely in his tracks. Marcus slowly stood up from his chair, smoothing his own tie. He did not look at Richard with the respect of a colleague. He looked at him like he was a disgusting insect that had just crawled onto the boardroom table. "Put the phone down, Richard," Marcus ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "And sit down and close your mouth before you embarrass yourself any further." Richard blinked, thoroughly confused by the sudden, aggressive hostility radiating from his CEO. "Marcus, you do not understand. This man is my father-in-law. He is a broke, toxic old man who lives in a shack. He is trying to ruin my promotion." "The only person who has ruined anything today is you," Marcus replied, his voice completely devoid of any warmth. "You are currently standing in the presence of the man who signs both of our paychecks. You are standing in the presence of the man who owns the very ground this skyscraper is built upon." Marcus turned his body slightly, gesturing toward me with a deep, respectful bow of his head. "Richard Sterling," Marcus announced, his voice ringing out like a death knell in the quiet room. "Allow me to formally introduce you to Arthur Vanguard. He is the original founder, the sole majority shareholder, and the absolute sovereign owner of Vanguard Commercial Holdings." Richard's entire body went completely rigid. "Furthermore," Marcus continued, driving the blade in perfectly, "Arthur Vanguard is also the sole financial architect, the solitary board member, and the exclusive owner of the $200 million investment fund known as Apex Global Holdings. You have spent the last 4 days pitching your entire career to your own father-in-law." I finally reached the massive, high-backed leather chair at the head of the table. I slowly pulled it out and sat down, resting my hands comfortably on the cool mahogany wood. I looked down the length of the table at the man who had tormented my daughter and stolen my grandchildren's future. The color completely drained from Richard's face, leaving him a sickening, translucent shade of pale gray. A thick bead of nervous sweat broke out on his forehead. His eyes darted wildly from me to Marcus, and then back to me. The $75,000 platinum watch on his wrist suddenly looked less like a crown and entirely more like a pair of heavy, inescapable handcuffs. The massive, beautiful illusion of his wealth, his power, and his untouchable status had just collided head-on with a freight train of absolute reality, and I was in the driver's seat. The silence in that massive, glass-walled boardroom was not merely heavy. It was a living, suffocating force, pressing down violently on the man who had spent an entire decade stealing the oxygen from my daughter's life. Richard sat completely paralyzed in his expensive, tailored suit, his mouth hanging slightly open, his eyes wide and glassy with sheer, unadulterated terror. The $75,000 platinum watch on his wrist ticked loudly in the quiet room, a sharp, metallic metronome counting down the final seconds of his manufactured existence. He looked at me, sitting at the head of the heavy mahogany table, and I could physically see his brain desperately misfiring, entirely unable to reconcile the image of the poor, pathetic grandfather he had banished from his driveway with the sovereign billionaire currently holding his entire professional and personal life in the palm of my hand. "You wanted to build an empire, Richard," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yet it echoed perfectly through the cavernous space. "You wanted to conquer the commercial skyline. But you made one fatal, arrogant miscalculation. You attempted to build your little kingdom directly on my land, using my resources, while actively trying to destroy my bloodline. And I simply will not allow that." Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. A thick sheen of cold sweat coated his forehead. He gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table, his knuckles turning stark white. "Arthur," he stammered, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its booming, pompous authority. "Arthur, please. There has been a misunderstanding. I was stressed. The pressure of providing for Sarah and the kids, it was crushing me. We are family. We can fix this quietly." "You permanently severed any claim to that word the night you threw me out of your house and told my grandchildren I was a toxic loser," I replied coldly, leaning back in the oversized leather chair. "Today is not about fixing anything. Richard, today is an execution. Marcus, proceed." Marcus, sitting rigidly to my right, did not show a single ounce of pity. He opened a sleek, black leather portfolio resting in front of him. He pulled out a thick stack of aggressively highlighted accounting ledgers and tossed them casually onto the center of the table, directly in front of Richard. "You operated under the delusion, Richard, that the accounting department was entirely too intimidated by your aggressive personality to double-check your expense reports," Marcus stated, his voice clipping the air like a razor. "You were wrong. A full internal audit, ordered directly by the chairman, was completed at 3 o'clock this morning. We have meticulously documented over $200,000 in corporate theft over the last 18 months. You charged lavish personal dinners to fake client accounts. You billed the company for luxury car rentals on supposed site visits that never actually occurred." Richard stared at the highlighted pages, his eyes darting frantically over the undeniable proof of his own criminal greed. He was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving under his expensive silk tie, while he stared in sheer terror at the corporate audit. He was completely oblivious to the fact that the most devastating, soul-crushing documents were still resting quietly inside the second, much thicker manila folder resting beneath my hands. "The company policy on embezzlement is absolute," Marcus continued, delivering the sentence with flawless, brutal precision. "You are terminated immediately. Strictly for cause. Your security badge has already been deactivated. You forfeit all unvested stock options. You surrender your entire quarterly bonus, and you will receive absolutely no severance package. Furthermore, we are legally obligated to report this financial misconduct to the state regulatory board. You will be entirely blacklisted from the commercial real estate industry by Monday morning." "No!" Richard gasped, a pathetic, desperate whine escaping his throat. He looked between Marcus and me, tears of pure self-pity welling up in his eyes. "You cannot do this. If I lose this job, if I lose the bonus, I lose the house, I lose the cars, I have nothing to fall back on." "Arthur, please, I am begging you. Think of Sarah, think of your grandchildren." "They need a father who can provide." The sheer audacity of his plea, using my daughter and my grandchildren as a human shield after everything he had done to them, ignited a white-hot, blinding fury deep within my chest. I sat forward, placing both of my hands flat on the mahogany table, pinning him with a glare that finally made him flinch and look away. "Do not ever speak my daughter's name again," I commanded, my voice dropping an octave, vibrating with absolute, lethal authority. I picked up the thick manila folder Elias had compiled, the very same folder I had shown Sarah in the diner. I slid it firmly down the polished length of the table. It came to a perfect stop right in front of his trembling hands. "Open it," I ordered. Richard reached out with shaking fingers and flipped the heavy cover open. Resting right on top were the legally binding, heavily stamped divorce decrees and the emergency custody orders, fully signed by his wife and filed with the state court mere hours ago. "Sarah signed those yesterday," I informed him, watching his eyes widen in fresh, horrific realization. "While you were drinking free champagne in a luxury hotel room I paid for, she was packing her entire life into boxes. She is completely gone. Richard, she and the children are safe at my home, surrounded by people who actually love them, and you are legally barred from ever coming within 5 miles of them again. You handed me the exact blueprint for a restraining order when you sent me that pathetic cease and desist letter, and I simply turned the weapon completely around." He let out a choked, devastated sob, burying his face in his hands. He believed losing his job and his family was the absolute bottom, fundamentally unaware that my lawyer, Evelyn Thorne, had already prepared a separate legal maneuver that would ensure he could never hold a position of financial trust anywhere in the country ever again. "Look at the next page. Richard!" I demanded sharply. "Look at exactly what you did." He slowly lowered his hands, his face a wet, pathetic mess, and flipped the page. He stared directly at the bank statements for Leo and Maya's college trust funds. The balances shining in harsh, black ink, $0. "That is the exact moment my capacity for mercy completely died," I told him, ensuring every single word cut entirely through to his soul. "You systematically forged withdrawal documents to steal your own children's future. You liquidated their education to pay for country club fees and private gambling debts. You are not a provider. Richard, you are a parasite. You drained the life out of my family to fuel a fake, hollow existence." "How am I supposed to live?" he cried, slamming his fists weakly against the table. A thoroughly broken man entirely consumed by his own impending ruin. "The bank will foreclose. They will take everything. You do not have a mortgage." "Richard," I corrected him, standing up slowly from the leather chair, towering over his pathetic, crumbling figure. "You have a mountain of secret, unsecured debt and a massive second loan that you completely hid from your wife. My legal team notified the lending institutions of your sudden catastrophic change in employment status exactly 10 minutes ago. They are initiating foreclosure proceedings on that massive suburban fortress immediately. Your luxury car is currently being loaded onto a repossession tow truck in the parking garage below us as we speak." I walked slowly around the massive table, stopping just a few feet away from his chair. He shrank away from me, physically recoiling from the immense power he had completely underestimated for 10 long years. "You banned me from your property because you thought my lack of wealth was toxic," I said softly, looking down at the absolute wreckage of the arrogant boy who had tried to break my daughter. "But true wealth is not the watch on your wrist or the car in your driveway. True wealth is the ability to protect the people you love. You have absolutely nothing, Richard. And you have no one to blame but the arrogant, foolish man staring back at you in the mirror." I turned my back on him and walked toward the heavy oak doors, leaving him completely alone in the sprawling, cold boardroom with nothing but his debts, his crimes, and the terrifying reality of his absolute, permanent ruin. The sound of a shattered ego is incredibly quiet, but the devastation it leaves behind echoes for an entire lifetime. While Richard was just beginning to understand the brutal, inescapable gravity of his new reality, I had one final, permanent investment to make to ensure his toxic shadow would never touch my family again. The collapse of Richard Sterling was swift, absolute, and entirely public. Evelyn Thorne, my ruthless family law attorney, executed the divorce proceedings with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing a fatal sickness. In the courtroom, stripped of his expensive corporate backing and his inflated executive title, Richard was nothing more than a panicking, deeply indebted man caught stealing from his own children. Evelyn presented the forged banking documents directly to the judge, and the ruling was beautifully merciless. Richard was legally ordered to repay every single stolen penny of the college trust funds, a mandate that forced him into an immediate and humiliating personal bankruptcy. Without the massive, fraudulent income he had leveraged to the absolute hilt, His sprawling suburban fortress was foreclosed upon by the bank within 45 days. His heavily financed German sports car was repossessed by a flatbed tow truck before he even finished packing up his desk at the Vanguard offices. The State Regulatory Board, presented with Marcus's undeniable forensic evidence of corporate embezzlement, permanently revoked his commercial real estate license. He was completely blacklisted from the industry he once claimed to rule as a king. The last I heard through the quiet corporate grapevine, the man who used to aggressively scream at my daughter for buying the wrong brand of sparkling water was now living in a cramped, poorly ventilated studio apartment on the far industrial side of the city. He spends his days desperately dodging collection calls and selling off his meticulously tailored bespoke suits to local pawn shops just to cover his mounting legal fees. He is a ghost, a hollow shell of a man entirely consumed by the very poverty he used to mock. But this story is not about him anymore. It is about the beautiful, vibrant life that bloomed in the space he left behind. A week after the divorce was finalized, I finalized a very different kind of contract. I purchased a beautiful, sprawling colonial home sitting on 5 acres of lush, heavily wooded land. It is securely tucked away at the end of a long, private road, completely hidden from the chaos and the noise of the city. I deeded the property entirely in Sarah's name, free and clear of any mortgage or debt, ensuring she would never again have to rely on a man for a safe roof over her head. The transformation in my daughter over the last 6 months has been nothing short of miraculous. The hunched, terrified woman who met me in that dimly lit diner is completely gone. In her place stands a strong, independent, and fiercely protective mother. She converted the bright, sunlit eastern wing of the new house into an art studio, finally picking up the canvases and oil paints she had abandoned 10 years ago to appease her narcissistic husband. I watch her paint in the mornings. Her face relaxed, her shoulders dropped, and I know I did exactly what a father is supposed to do. I protected my blood. I moved out of my small cottage and took over the converted guest house on her new property. I even built a massive, state-of-the-art outdoor hydroponic system for my Phalaenopsis orchids along the southern wall, perfectly balancing the water flow and liquid nutrients to induce continuous flowering. A peaceful, quiet hobby I can finally share with my grandchildren. And then there are my beautiful grandchildren. They are no longer banished to their rooms for making too much noise. The heavy, oppressive silence of their old house has been permanently replaced by the chaotic, wonderful sound of genuine childhood joy. Leo and I spend our long weekend afternoons in the massive backyard. We are currently building a sprawling, complex wooden treehouse nestled high in the sturdy branches of an ancient oak tree. I teach him how to measure the wood, how to swing a heavy hammer, and how to build a strong foundation that will actually last. Maya runs through the tall grass below us, chasing butterflies and laughing with a pure lightness that fills my entire chest with absolute warmth. The world will constantly try to tell you that true wealth is measured by the designer logo on your car, the prestigious title on your business card, or the massive zeros in your bank account. That is a dangerous, fragile illusion built by deeply insecure men who have absolutely nothing real to hold on to in the dark. True wealth is the absolute, unbreakable safety of the people you love. True wealth is the quiet peace of a sunny Sunday afternoon, surrounded by the beautiful noise of a family that is entirely whole. I spent my entire life building a ruthless corporate empire, but my greatest masterpiece was patiently dismantling a tyrant to rescue my daughter. Justice is not always loud, and it is rarely swift, but when it is executed with flawless, loving precision, it is the most deeply satisfying outcome in the world. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you felt the satisfaction of watching an arrogant, manipulative bully finally get exactly what he deserved, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with anyone who needs a reminder that the good guys can still win. I would love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment down below with the word karma so I know you made it all the way to the very end. And do not forget to hit that hype button so this video can reach more viewers just like you.